she's a mountain, then you're an ocean.
Hi, everybody. This is Lori, and I am the founder and CEO of a company called Inclusivity, and also the author of a new book called You Can Save the World. In fact, you're the only one who can. And this is our podcast, and our podcast is called Inclusivi-TEA's Sustainability, and it is all about artists and creativity and writers and musicians and also sustainable living. So we interview a host of interesting, fun people. And today we are really lucky to have on the podcast Vikki Reich, who actually went to my alma mater, Grinnell College, and I met her last week when we were at a storytelling event where both of us told stories about our lives. And when I heard Vikki, I thought, wow, this is a woman I want to interview on my podcast. So Vikki, thank you so much for agreeing to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
So it is a pleasure to have you. I always like to start out a little bit by asking somebody to just tell me a little bit about what you do, about your life.
Okay. Well, I was a social worker for many years. I worked for Hennepin County Adult Protection and investigated abuse and neglect of vulnerable adults for 15 years. Concurrently, I also started blogging in 2006, kind of at the height of, or kind of the beginning, but then shortly after the height of blogging. And so I really started honing my storytelling skills and getting more interested in my writing, and actually did an apprenticeship with the Loft Literary Center in creative nonfiction. And that kind of was towards the end of my social work career because the work was really hard. And after 15 years of kind of seeing the worst in what people could do to each other, I really needed a break. And so I left my job in 2012 to pursue a creative life full time. And that has included freelance writing, freelance communications consulting. And then also I produce a live reading event called Listen to Your Mother, Twin Cities, with my co-producer, Green. And it started out actually in Madison, Wisconsin, and it was founded by a woman named Ann Immig, and she eventually took it national. Mm-hmm. And so we were kind of a Twin Cities franchise, but she's since kind of disbanded the national, and we hosted here basically, through the rights that she gives us to do that. And what started as this one show celebrating motherhood in May has turned into 4 sold out shows that we do. So we do it twice a year now. We do the 2 Mother's Day shows, and then we do 2 shows at the holidays. And both events center on kind of family life and stories about parenthood, motherhood specifically, to kind of give a voice to motherhood, because those stories often aren't told. And so that's what I do. I do a lot of my own writing, consulting, and then producing.
So for the Listen to Your Mother shows, is it various storytellers telling stories about their mothers? Are you reading someone's work? How does that work?
So it's all local authors. Mm-hmm. Some people have never even told a story in public before. So we're not looking necessarily for the professional storytellers and writers out there. We're really looking to give a platform to women who feel like they have a story to tell, either about their own motherhood, their choices not to be a mother, or their mothers, or who mothered them. So it's the theme we interpret pretty loosely. But we've had people that are like, I've never told this to anybody before in my life. And then we have, more seasoned storytellers who have done it before. But it is a 3 to 5 minute piece that they prepare for the show, and it's not memorized. We read from the works, and it's all original and all true.
It sounds lovely.
Yeah, I think, having been doing this for nearly 10 years now, it's amazing to me, not only how empowering it is for someone to tell their story, and it can change their lives. We've seen women who are like, wow, that was the beginning for me, and now I'm doing speaking engagements,
Mhm.
and now I'm, writing a book, and now, I had the courage to start my own business. I mean, it's pretty incredible. But I think the other part of it that certainly appeals to me, is that I really do believe that storytelling can change the world. And I think it's not only life changing for the person telling the story, but some of the topics that are brought forward and some of the personal experiences that people share
Mhm.
can change the hearts and minds of people who are listening.
I love that. And that's, one of my compelling reasons for doing the podcast is that I love people's stories. I'm a geriatric psychologist in my other world, in addition to the other stuff I'm doing, the business and the book. But what I love about being a geriatric psychologist is that's a lot of what it is listening to people's stories. And people are pretty amazing. And across the board, people have stories that we should hear and that are worth speaking and listening to. And so it's one of the reasons I do the podcast is to give people just a space to tell a story. So, Vikki, looking back at your life, you stopped a social work career to become a writer. Were you a writer like, have you always been a writer? Has that been something that's sort of been a hobby for a long time?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't say I had always been a writer. When I was young and when I was in college, I did write a lot of music. Um, so that was words and, not only music, but lyrics and performed at Grinnell at times. And that was like a great outlet for my creativity. And then kind of as a grown up out in the professional world and then having kids, I didn't do that as much. And I think that I started journaling and then I started blogging and then I, kind of tapped into that love of words that I've always had. And I always say that I grew up in a family of storytellers. That I was the first woman in my family to go to college, but um, my mother and my aunts would sit around all the time and they would just tell these incredible, hysterical stories that were always based in the reality of their lives.
Mhm.
And I would just sit there kind of in awe of this natural storytelling. And when I started writing my own pieces and my own stories again, I tapped into also that family history of what it's like to sit around a circle and just kind of tell these family stories or these personal stories and laugh or feel all kinds of different things. So that's kind of the background on that. And then so then I just started writing more and putting myself out there and submitting pieces and that sort of thing.
So I want to go back to the blog in a minute, but I'd like to ask your musical sort of past. So in college, you were writing music and performing music. When did that start? When did you first realize that you were a musical?
I remember like from a very young age, like 7, begging my mother for guitar lessons, and we were not, like I said, like I kind of grew up in a working class family. We weren't like nobody was sitting around playing the violin or doing anything like that. People were working, they were busy. And my mom was just like, "Oh my God, I've heard that when kids start instruments, they quit them." And I was like, "No, I promise." And she made me beg for like, 2 years. And then she was like, "Okay, I guess you're serious." And so she got me a guitar and found me a teacher. And so I started, I think, when I guess maybe I was 8. So maybe I only begged for a year. But, and then from 8 to 16, I took lessons every week with the same teacher who was kind of this really interesting kind of hippie, you know, total musician, full-time musician and teacher. And she was such an incredible force in my life for good, because all through adolescence and just, family stuff and chaos of just growing up and she was just this rock. And then when I was 16, it was just like I was too busy
Yeah.
doing other stuff at school to really continue lessons, but I continued to write music. And then in college, I just felt like, wow, I mean, you have a lot to studying to do, but you also have a lot of free time, and I would just play for hours and write for hours. And yeah, and then, like I said, I kind of stopped doing that. My daughter, actually, who is 16, plays piano and guitar and cello, and she's always kind of shaming me gently and lovingly about the fact that I don't really play anymore. So last week she was trying to teach me a Miley Cyrus song. So
Okay. So
trying to entice me back into, that aspect of my past.
and do you think you will play again?
I don't know. I feel like I have only so much energy for creativity,
Mhm.
and I think it's a lot more focused on storytelling and writing than it was previously.
When you were writing songs, what were the themes of your songs? What were you inspired by?
It was all really personal narrative. I mean, it was all creative nonfiction, really,
Yeah.
all about just, you know, heartbreak and first loves and sorting out your identity and dealing with your family and reckoning with their place in the world and all of that kind of thing. So I think if there's anything that has remained consistent really over time between the music and the writing I do now, it is that aspect of personal truth telling.
And when you wrote your first blog, so we jump forward a number of years, you've had
Yeah.
a career in social work, and I'm guessing you were sort of feeling like this has been good work. It's been important that I've done it, but it's maybe time to start thinking about not focusing so much on the social work. What was the first blog about? Do you remember?
I do remember. I do remember, and I'm embarrassed.
Oh, please tell us anyway.
The first blog post I wrote, I believe, was called "Ode to a Baby Carrot," and it was a short rhyming poem about, shockingly, a baby carrot, and that was it. And I think that blogging was still relatively
Yeah.
new, and it was just this idea of, I had young children. So my son, I think, was 7, and my daughter was, let's see, my daughter was 2. And it was just this idea like, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I'm going to claim this space for myself. And with no expectation that anyone would ever read it. And then early on, it was really focused a lot on writing stories about parenting and my experience as a lesbian mom, and really that is the voice and the storytelling that carried forward eventually. Once we got past the ode to the baby carrot, and we could get into other things, but it was always a mix of it was always personal stories, sometimes parenting struggles, but it was also um, a mix in tone of humor and kind of, I like to think, touching.
Mhm.
Kind of had some emotional resonance too. So it wasn't all of one thing or the other.
And when you started it, did you have were you pulled to write? Like, was there something that just made you feel like you had to do it? What was the sort of the impetus that?
Well, I did have this love of storytelling from, as I said, my family. And I think that, I was at that point in my life where I was becoming, but not completely disillusioned with my career in social work. But I also think having children really um, shifted my priorities and kind of I don't know, it just shifted my priorities in some ways. And I was reading blogs at the time, and I thought, well, I could do this.
Mhm.
I could tell stories, and I could have a place of my own to do that. And if my friends or family are interested in any way, they could always read the stories, and that would be a way for me to share those. And so I think that was kind of what started it.
Yeah. And do you either of your children are either of your children storytellers, would you say? Or both?
Not in any kind of formal way, but they can tell a good story.
And you
Yeah,
said you
my daughter is more, her creativity is really centered in music and composition. And then my son is, he's an engineering major at Carnegie Mellon. So his creativity, and he is a creative person,
Mhm.
comes out, he paints, and then he likes product design. So
Mhm.
they have their creativity too.
I think that's something that I've sort of, as I've done the podcast and interviewed people um, across, the creative side, and then people who are really involved in sustainable living. What I've recognized is that creativity has so many avenues that
Hmm.
really almost everyone is creative in some way. And whether it's, creating new lunches for your family, or writing, or painting, or speaking and telling stories, there's so many ways to be creative. And sometimes it is work, sometimes it's creating a product,
Hmm.
or thinking about a new way to run your classroom. There are just so many different ways to be creative. And I think that's what's kind of exciting and fun about talking about it,
Yeah.
because even through all of that, there are such common threads.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree.
So you said that you blogged at least partially from the perspective of a lesbian mom. And so I just want to know, is there anything in particular, any blogs that, or lessons that you learned that sort of stand out for you as far as that part of your story?
Um, no, I don't think in particular. I think I think in many ways I'm a classic overthinker. And so I think that while I was living that kind of intense experience, when you have younger kids, I mean, I think parenthood is very intense. And I think that, my identity layered on top of that, and it being the early 2000s when we didn't our my mine and my partner's relationship wasn't legally recognized, and we had to go through the second parent adoptions just for her to actually be legally, the kid's mother, even though we were in this process to have children together from the get-go, and so, but I will say that in sharing all of those pieces of our lives with other people, it kind of feeds into what I said earlier about the potential of stories to change the world. Because as my as my writing deepened, and as my readership shifted from the people who knew me to people who didn't know me, those stories became Im- important also almost as a political act. So it was a personal outlet for me, the writing, and then it also became political, as many things do, because personal is political. But and then I mean there was a lot that was beautiful from all of that. People who would write me privately and tell me, "Wow, um, I never thought of this way," or I've always like there were people that were like, "I've always been opposed to gay marriage, but then I read your stories and I think, oh, I want the best for you." And I think that when we know people's stories, whose story is different than our own, and our minds are opened, and then our hearts are opened, and that's how we make progress. It has to be connection.
I think that's perfect. That we need people to care about each other and to know each other's stories. And as you said, once I know your story, I can't unknow it. And so then to continue to want bad things for you, or to continue to not want you to have a full life, becomes much more difficult once I've seen you as vulnerable, once I've seen you as human. And so I think
And
that's,
once I've claimed you as somebody in my life, whether we're close or not, it's like, you know, yeah.
yeah. That, I think that's a definite service that writers do. I think writers and artists, painters and other artists as well. I think that there's a huge role for creating the world that we want
Hmm.
through our writing and painting and all of those creative outlets.
Yeah. And I think in the beginning, I had this feeling like these are stories. My stories are not the ones that I'm seeing told. Certainly, as a queer parent or whatever, and I had this sense in the beginning that I was essentially writing myself into existence. And I think that so many people have to write themselves into existence. And I think that when people take the chance to do that, not just myself, but I'm thinking of all of the other stories that I've listened to and been a part of in producing Listen to Your Mother. When people write themselves and their experience into existence, it's like you give all these people access to something so different. And I know how much I've learned from all of that too, from other people.
So for you, and this may be a really hard question, but for you, as you were doing that, writing yourself into existence, which I think is a beautiful way to say it, what did that feel like? Emotionally, sort of, what was that for you?
I think that there was part of it that was um, empowering
Mhm.
to be able to put into words an experience and have it resonate with other people, whether other people are saying, yeah, me too, or people saying, wow, I've never thought about it like that. So I think that it was very empowering in that way. And I think that also through the process of blogging over the years that I did it more intensely, it really did allow me to begin to claim my identity as a writer and a storyteller. And I think that that had always been a part of me, but not a part of me that I necessarily felt empowered to claim. And so in the process of doing that and writing down those stories, and generally by the time I would write a story down, I had a little bit of emotional distance from it. So it wasn't like I was bleeding on the page.
Yeah.
Um, so it was really more like the process that was empowering than the particular stories themselves.
I like the way you said that a lot, Vicki, and I particularly appreciate the idea of claiming your identity because what I find all the time is that people have a hard time, particularly claiming the creative side of themselves.
Hmm.
So I've had many people say, "Well, I write, but I'm not really a writer,"
Hmm.
or "I paint, but I'm not an artist." And these are people who sometimes really are already selling their art, but
Hmm.
have this difficulty claiming that
Yeah,
label, that name, even though it really is a part of who they are. And so I think the idea of working yourself into claiming that, because there's something powerful about that.
absolutely. And I think also women in particular have a very difficult time claiming certain things. I think we have a difficult time claiming our experience. I think we have a difficult time honoring what we know. And I think that, especially when it comes to creativity, I think that we have a tendency to minimize what we do. And I think that, and I can remember the first time I said, because for a long time I called myself a blogger. That was really easy
Mhm.
because everybody was a blogger, right? So I'm just a blogger. I'm just like everybody else. Um, but I think that at some point that shifted, and I remember when I said, no, I'm going to start calling myself a writer. And I don't know, I can't remember if it was after the first time I read a piece on a stage.
Mhm.
Um, I think that might have been a turning point for me, and that was no, it was probably when I started the Loft program and creative nonfiction because I was like, I didn't get here just because I dabbled. You
Yeah,
know, I worked at telling stories. I worked at the writing, and that's why I'm here. So,
yeah. And I think, all of us, I think, have a desire to be seen by others, to be understood. And I think allowing ourselves to see ourselves too is a part
mhm.
of that process. So allowing ourselves to honestly see all the things that we can do and how strong we are is a tremendous growth thing for everybody
Absolutely.
and necessary if we're going to, in fact, change the world and create a world where everyone thrives and where all of us are welcome. I think it entails that sort of self awareness.
And I don't think, I mean, certainly individually we don't benefit, but I don't think society as a whole benefits when we keep ourselves small.
Agreed. So everybody, we are going to now take a pause. We're going to end this particular episode, and we're going to continue with Vicki in our next episode. So we'll be doing another video where I will ask Vicki some things like her philosophy of life and what advice she would have for young artists coming up, young writers coming up. I also want to ask a little bit more, Vicki, about how you think some of your social work experiences have have colored your choices or your writing or both. And then I want to ask you to tell a story from your life. So I don't know what it's going to be, but something that feels like yours, because I think for all of us, it's good for us to look back at our lives and figure out a story that feels like we claim it. It's something we claim for ourselves. So I'm going to end this now. Vikki, thank you so much for being here for this first episode. And then we will have another episode released, which you can also enjoy. Thanks, everybody.
If she's a